We have a great team today to help us explore these and similar issues. Each of them will speak for 15 minutes. I will try and send them a message, a polite message, when they cross the 15 minutes. I just want to check if Richard has joined us in the meantime. I don't think so. Okay. So what we'll do, we're still very hopeful that we will be able to establish connection with Professor Falk, but we will start with the other three speakers. And our first speaker, therefore, will be Yara Hawari, who is a senior analyst of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle Eastern politics at the University of Exeter, where she taught various undergraduate courses and continues to be an honorary research fellow there. In addition to her academic work, which focused on indigenous studies and oral history, she is also a frequent political commentator, writing for various media outlets, including The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera English. Yara believes that the Palestinian demand for justice and liberation had to be internationalized. The forces that oppress us also oppress our comrades around the world. This is why Palestine must not only be an anti-colonial struggle, it must also be a class and feminist struggle. So Yara, I hope it's okay if I pushed you to be the first speaker, and you're not angry with me for doing that, and the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ilan, for that introduction, and thank you to all of our comrades and friends for hosting and for joining us today to talk about this important topic, and one that has sort of come to the forefront more recently for various reasons. Apartheid as a framework has for a long time been used to describe the situation in Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And it has this really lengthy history in Palestinian discourse and intellectual production, which was forged by the solidarity with the Black struggle in South Africa and this recognition of very similar structures of oppression. But it particularly became more popular after the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa because it presented this successful model of struggle and kind of a way out. The apartheid framework has developed, and more recently it heavily relies on the rights-based discourse, which presumes the centrality of international law and therefore the notion that justice will be achieved with the application of international law. But apartheid wasn't always understood in these terms.
Please, sorry, please someone please unmute yourself. Unmute everything.
Okay. But apartheid hasn't always been understood in Apartheid hasn't always been understood in these terms, and the history of its terms and its application on the situation in Palestine has really much more of a radical understanding, one that recognizes and seeks to dismantle the ongoing Zionist settler colonial project and sees apartheid as just one mechanism of that settler colonial regime. And as I said, over the years, it's been apartheid has been increasingly applied to various extents by international and local organizations, as well as scholars world over. And international organizations and Israeli organizations in particular have often sought to describe the occupation, the military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza as an apartheid system, but stopping there. Now, of course, we all know that more recently, some organizations are now going further to describe the entire system of oppression from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea as apartheid, as a regime that dominates the Palestinian people as a whole. And a really brilliant report on this was the one that was compiled by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley for Esquire. And it's a much more deterritorialized understanding of apartheid. And in that way, it understands and includes the Palestinian people as a whole, including those in exile. Now, today, I was asked to specifically focus on the different characteristics of apartheid in the West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem. even though we have asserted that apartheid is a mechanism used to dominate all Palestinians, it exists in different, slightly different ways across the different territories. And I think the West Bank is probably where apartheid aesthetically can be seen much more clearly. And I don't mean to say that it's worse or better, but I think this is where we see very obvious manifestations of petty apartheid, i.e. the segregation in the routine of daily life, so separate roads, separate resources, etc. Although these do exist to some extent across the Green Line. So the West Bank has been under Israeli military occupation since 1967. A system of military law is imposed on approximately 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. And meanwhile, approximately 500,000 Jewish Israeli Jewish illegal settlers are governed by Israeli civil law. Now, the racial character of the situation is further confirmed by the fact that all West Bank Jewish settlers enjoy the protection of Israeli civil law on the basis of being Jewish, whether they are Israeli citizens or not. So the military law in the West Bank includes a whole system which prevents Palestinians doing just about anything, making anything an arrestable offense. A meeting of 10 people, for example, can be characterized by the military regime as a political rally and thus deemed illegal. And if Palestinians are detained or arrested under this military law, they're put through this military court system, which has a 99% conviction rate, and they're held in Israeli military prisons, which are for Palestinian political prisoners. So this dual legal system is indicative of an apartheid regime, but there are actually a lot of other aspects of life in the West Bank that point to this apartheid regime. And I'm going to highlight just a few. So the first one I want to highlight is the issue of land and resources. So from 1967 to the present day, more than 200 Israeli illegal settlements have been established in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And it's important to note that the settlement enterprise in 1967 was spearheaded by an Israeli Labour government, not a far right-wing government, but actually a Labour government. And today, these settlements are home to over 600,000 Israeli Jewish illegal settlers. And I'm honing in on settlements because they really are the most dominant factor in shaping Palestinian life in the West Bank. The Israeli regime consistently and relentlessly steals and annexes thousands of dunams of Palestinian land for its settlement enterprise and infrastructure, which results in families being cut off from each other, communities being severed, farmers losing their farmland. And beyond the settlements themselves, there is this vast infrastructure of roads, of factories, of power plants, etc., all used to support them. And all of this infrastructure, of course, means more land. And indeed, there are hundreds of kilometers of roads for settler use only. And the Israeli regime, in turn, has also placed hundreds of roadblocks and checkpoints nearby these settlements. And it's needless to say that these checkpoints deeply hinder Palestinian movement. They can be closed randomly. Palestinians are funneled onto these single-lane roads, making movement really a very challenging affair. Now, I'm sure you all know that the West Bank is this really, really tiny piece of land, and yet it can literally take hours to get from one city to another. And of course, the apartheid wall, which was built in the early 2000s, adds to all of this and has resulted in huge tracts of land being confiscated and has essentially resulted in the Bantustanization of Palestinian residential areas, making it incredibly easy for the Israeli army to lock down an entire Palestinian village or town. Meanwhile, the Israeli regime also directs the majority of the resources in the West Bank to the Jewish Israeli population. And it does this very easily now, thanks to the division of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C by the Oslo Accords. So the Israeli military controls Area C, which is 61% of the land in the West Bank, which just so happens to include the most resources, including water resources. And these are all diverted to Israeli illegal settlement use, as well as Israeli settlement use across the Green Line. Now, Area C is not only, I mentioned the resources, but it's also where the most fertile land is. And Israel actually makes millions from produce grown illegally in this area. It's actually estimated that the loss of access to Area C is estimated to cost Palestinians around $480 million per year. And this leads me on to talk about a really important aspect of the Israeli apartheid regime in the West Bank, which is its control, or rather the complete subsuming of the Palestinian economy. And actually, there isn't such a thing as the Palestinian economy. So in 1948, what was once a thriving economy was totally shattered. It was later brought under this complete economic subjugation thanks to a series of peace agreements, namely the 1994 Paris Protocol, which is part of the Oslo Accords. Now, this is an incredibly insidious document. What it did was it imposed an unequal customs union, granting Israeli businesses direct access to the Palestinian market, but restricting Palestinian goods entry into the Israeli one. It also gave the Israeli state control over tax collection, and it entrenched the use of the shekel, the Israeli shekel, in the West Bank and Gaza, leaving the Palestinian Authority no means to impose fiscal control or adopt any kind of macroeconomic policies. And so what this in effect means today is that Israel has full direct and indirect control over the levers of the Palestinian economy, and is actually in complete control of most of Palestinian infrastructure. And it's able, and it also has the ability to restrict access to it. So really what the situation is that Palestinian businesses can neither compete with Israeli companies or produce enough to meet local demands. Meanwhile, Israeli businesses are making money not only by dominating the Palestinian market and exploiting their position, but also using Palestinian labor very cheaply. So as a result, Palestinians find themselves in this horrible situation of being forced to buy goods from their occupier that was grown on stolen land, from money earned in occupying in the occupier's businesses. So as you can see, Israel has effective and almost total control over Palestinian life, not just in the West Bank, of course. But before I end, I'm not sure how much time I have, but I want to talk about something that activists and human rights organizations have been talking about a lot since the pandemic, and this is vaccine apartheid. And I think this really highlights the system of colonial racial segregation. Now, as we know, the Israeli government is boasting the fastest vaccine rollout in the world. I think 51% of the population have received the first dose, and of that, 37 have received both doses. Meanwhile, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, there has been no vaccination program, with only small tidbits of batches here and there, a few thousand for medical workers, some for laborers, but I think that's stopping now. There was also a batch for the Palestinian Authority and their cronies. And they, all in all, a very, very tiny amount, and yet the infections are rising. And so Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are going into yet another lockdown in an attempt to control the outbreak. Now, Israel's narrative, of course, has been that it's prioritizing the vaccine for its own citizens, pushing this idea that there is a separation between the two populations, when, of course, there isn't. It's also been evading its responsibility under international law, and in particular the Fourth Geneva Convention, which stipulates that an occupying power must provide for the health and well-being of those they occupy. And even more insidious than the fact that they're not providing the vaccines to Palestinians, which they have to, they're also actively blocking the delivery of vaccines. And even worse than all of this, Israel was talking about sending a surplus supply of doses to countries like Honduras and Czech Republic and Hungary, etc., in return for political favors, like for them moving their embassies to Jerusalem. Now, all of this has to be put in this context of the fact that the West Bank and Gaza are confronting COVID-19 from the reality of apartheid and military occupation, which completely weakens their ability to deal with the virus. And it's true that many health systems around the world are struggling to deal with the pandemic. But in particular, the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has depleted the medical capabilities of the Palestinian people. There are constantly shortages in equipment, medication, and staff. There's all kinds of military raids, restrictions on imports. In Gaza, they have been completely, the hospitals have been completely obliterated. And meanwhile, the manifestations of occupation go on. Now, just to give you a really nasty example of this, in 2020, last year, the Israeli regime promised at some point a halt on Palestinian home demolitions. But what actually happened was Palestinian home demolitions actually doubled, and it rendered the pandemic motto, stay at home, a really incredibly cruel irony. So I'm going to stop here, but I just want to again highlight that there are so many manifestations of apartheid in the West Bank and indeed across historic Palestine. And I just tried to give a very quick and concise summary of what life is like under the apartheid regime in the West Bank.
Thank you so much, Yara. I think it was actually good to start with apartheid from below, so to speak, not in abstract notions, but the daily experience of apartheid. And thank you so much to keeping to the time. The good news is that Richard is there, but we have still some technical problems.